intentional because the Sonora that I have this year has really nice baking properties, but for whatever reason, I didn't feel like it had a lot of flavor. So I started doing things to try to introduce a little more flavor to it. First, I tried a boiling water cracked Sonora soaker. That didn't help it at all. Then I sprouted Sonora berries and put sprouted berries in. That seemed to help it a bit, but again, I hate getting these rock hard little sprouted berries on the crust. So I started grinding it. And the result is, for me, I feel like it's a better flavored bread. It keeps longer, it keeps moist longer with these sprouts in there. I found that these sprouts do give the crust, it's a little tougher. The crust is tougher than I like, but I feel like the positives outweigh the negatives, so that's how I prepare the Sonora bread. And that's how we'll prepare our Sonora bread today. So right now we're just scaling out the ingredients. We're doing dry ingredients. As soon as those are all scaled out, we're going to mix the Renan #1 and the spiral mixer over there. We're just going to give it a couple minutes to incorporate the ingredients. We're going to pull it back out, and then we'll start another one. So we'll give the Renan a little autolyse while we're mixing the second dough. When we're done incorporating the ingredients from the second dough, which will be the Sonora, we'll pull that out and we'll throw the Renan back in, and we'll finish that mix. And then after both of those mixes are done, we're going to put the einkorn dough in there, and we're going to start mixing the einkorn. The einkorn, as I found out real quickly once I started working with it, doesn't have much mixing tolerance. It mixes for a very short period of time, about 5 minutes on first speed. I've got a double arm mixer and an Artifex mixer. I mix it for 5 minutes on that. We'll see what the equivalent is on a spiral mixer. That'll probably be even shorter. So that's how we'll organize the mixes. I guess I just wanted to say a word about mixing is really, our first chance when we get a new wheat or a different wheat that we haven't used to discover its properties. So for me, when I get a new batch of wheat in, I eye it like a hawk the first time it's in the mixer, and just see where that point is from the point where it's building strength in the mixer to where you start, where it levels off, and then you actually start to see less strength develop in the dough, and then of course you want to shut it off at that point. Once you fine tune it and you go through several bakes, I like to shut it off before it gets to its strongest point. Because the mixing phase isn't the only time that you're building strength into your dough. The bulk ferment also adds a lot of strength to your dough. So it's not necessary to fully develop your dough, I find, for the breads I make in the mixer. You want to go, 80% and stop. I like to get it not fully developed in the mixer. I like to give it an hour rest, give it a fold, and then I roll it into my retarder for an overnight ferment at 47 degrees. It takes about 15 hours before I pull it out and start working the dough, dividing, shaping. I also think the retarded bulk ferment adds even more strength than a typical, say, 3-hour room temp bulk ferment would. So typically my breads come out with so much strength, I don't even really give them a pre-shape. I'll just kind of use my scraper to round them up a little bit, put them on boards, let them rest on boards for a good 3 hours because the dough's still cold. It takes that long for them to get active again, to warm up a bit before they're ready for their final shape. And we're going to do pretty much the same routine here and see how that goes.
The reason why you bulk ferment versus shaping and then giving them a long delayed fermentation?
Yeah, so the question is, why do I retard it in bulk rather than shape loaves? And that's just has to do with my schedule. My farmer's market is a really early one. There's no way I could roll out my shaped retarded loaves, throw them in the oven, and go to market, because I'd have to start at 10 at night and work through the night and then go to market. So for me, it's just that schedule doesn't work. But I did find one real positive aspect to bulk retarding, and that is once you take that dough out, you can make a very wet, sloppy dough. Roll it into that retarder and bulletproof it at cold temperatures, bring it out, and the coldness itself, and I guess the long cold fermentation in there, adds so much strength to the dough. It's like you've added 20% less hydration, and it's much easier. I mean, I wish I had this trick when I had employees. It would have been so much easier. But it really does make it easier to work with very wet doughs. They come out and they're much easier to handle. So that's a real positive to doing it this way. It doesn't have to be done this way. It could all be room temperature, and you get very nice bread that way too.
And do you adjust your quantity of leaven because you're relying on the long ferment in order to make sure it's there?
Yeah, I was curious about the levain percentage, whether that would change when I went from all room temperature baking to the bulk ferment and the retarder.
I guess it gets a long time out of the retarder as well. Like you said, it's 60 boards for 3 hours. So
Yeah, I wound up not changing my levain percentage at all. I started just, okay, let's go with what I've been doing and see if it works, and it worked. All right, Jesse, we got all the flour?
I got your flour all the way down.
Now we need water at 68 degrees.
Okay.
So let's, we're doing the Renan first.
Okay.
Let's throw it on the scale. Let's, do we have Jonathan yet? Or is this? Jonathan, you want to do the water?
Sure. You want me to weigh on the starter?
And I threw the starter in there because it's ready.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Fast.
Great. In the fridge.
In the fridge. Yeah, go ahead and slice off what you need. Here's a container, Jonathan, if you need one.
How much water are we doing?
It was 3 kilos, a little over 3 kilos, and 6 to 8 degrees.
Was that Levain what he was mixing the flour?
Yeah, there was. So what happened was, I sent up my dried starter. I dry out my starter for the guys to get going last night and do 2 feedings. It's so difficult to deal with other people's levains. You don't know rates of activity, and I should have known that. I should have known that was a mistake. But so it wasn't anywhere near being ready today, and I panicked. But luckily, Grayson Gill, who's doing a class, had some ripe levain. So we used that to feed the final stage of the levain build, and it worked. So we're ready to go. So I was really worried.
It's a stiff levain versus
I use a stiff levain. I made that switch a long time ago when I felt, and it was when I was working with all room temperature doughs, making really wet doughs, very sloppy doughs, and I felt like I needed more strength in that dough to be able to work it properly, and I switched to a stiff levain to see what would happen, and it helped. So I made that switch a long time ago, and I was doing things very differently. I've just kept it that way because it continues to work for me. It doesn't have to be a stiff levain. It could be liquid, I'm sure, but for my levain it worked. And then I throw it back in the fridge when you're done with that.
Gotcha.
What do I feed my levain? Whole wheat flour. Yeah.
how long between feedings?
My levain build goes from, I'll take my dry starter out. So, I'll take my dry starter out. How I dry my starters, I'll take some ripe levain. I take 3 ounces of ripe levain. I'll mix in 12 ounces of flour and just work it in until it looks kind of like breadcrumb consistency. So you've got these little bits of sourdough that in a short amount of time will just become rock hard little bits of dried out sourdough in this flour. I'll take that the night before I mix, sieve out the sourdough particles that are larger, particles than the flour. So I'm separating the little sourdough particles from the flour. I add water to the sourdough particles to make a mush, to soften. I let it sit for an hour. Add the flour back that I sifted out. That's the first feed. So that's feed 1. That ferments overnight for about 12 hours. 40% starter to flour. And then I'll do 2 quick feeds. So the next one is a 4-hour ferment, 50% starter to flour. After 4 hours of ferment for that, I'll do a 3-hour ferment for my final levain. So it's young, but it's active. I like to not have a sour flavor to my bread. I like the flavor of the wheat to come through first. And so those are the steps I take to make that happen.
You feed them pretty warm.
It's a 78, 80 degree dough. Yeah. Warmish, yeah. The overnight is a little cooler. That's more like 70,
Yeah.
75. So as soon as we get everything ready for the levain, or for the Vernon dough, we'll get that mix going. With my mixer, it's this double arm mixer. You can look inside, you can see what's happening. I was picturing that scenario for our class where we could all sit around and watch how the dough develops. And I forgot that these stupid things have lids with the little peephole. It's for our safety. But we're not going to be able to watch that development, all of us. So we're just going to have to make a judgment. This is a new kind of mixer for me. I've only mixed in a spiral a couple times. So we're just going to have to keep an eye on it, see when that level of development is, and stop it there. We'll take them out, we'll let them sit outside at room temperature for about an hour, we'll give them a fold, then we'll wheel them into the retarder.
How are you going to judge stuff?
When to stop the mix?
Everybody is different, right? Like, sound,
Well,
window pane.
for some wheats, I'll wait to hear the sucking sound. And as soon as I hear it, I turn it off. Do you guys know what I mean by that?
No.
Does that happen with spiral mixers too?
Yeah.
You guys-
Yes.
It does?
Yeah.
Okay. So there'll come a time, first, your mix is kind of a mush. You mix it, you see more gluten bonds forming. It's holding together a bit more of the dough is sticking to the arm. And then it'll get to a point where dough is pulling apart from itself. And it'll make this sound, this kind of sucking sound.
Okay.
I don't like to mix too much after that point. I feel that it's pretty well developed at that point. That's when I'll stop. I'll definitely give it a fold. I will develop it more with a fold. Sometimes 2, depending on the week.
How much time in between each fold?
Well, I wait an hour before I fold. If it takes 2 folds, I don't give it more than another half hour. Any other questions about so far?
What percentage of water we hold back?
Let's hold back 5%. Yeah. So this is another thing I typically do with my mixes is I'll only add 90% to the water when I'm first incorporating all the ingredients. I'll hold out 10%. This makes it this is very useful practice for a very wet dough. If you put all the water in at once, you're starting with a soup and you're spending so much time trying to get that dough to come together, and it's a waste of time. So what I do is I'll put in 90%, hold out 10%. That way the dough comes together quicker, and I've got a little dispenser that after the oddities, when we get going on the mix again, I'll just dribble that last 10% into the side of the bowl until it's gone. Usually takes about 5 minutes to do that. As the dough mixes, and it slowly incorporates the rest of the water in. So you're starting with a dough that comes together, and you're not wasting time because pretty much the whole time that dough's being worked in the mixer, it's got enough strength that you're actually accomplishing something. And another thing with my mixer, I don't know if it works as well with spirals, is that wetting the side of the bowl like that completely changes the action of the dough in the mixer. Instead of a lot of dough sticking to the bowl and you're mixing kind of a lot of the dough in the center, keeping the dough wet keeps the whole dough in play. So it really improves the activity of the dough.
Great.
Let's do it. Let's go with the sodium.